Hello, I'm Jonathan Harbour, and welcome to the StartED Mentor Series. I'm thrilled today to have with us Peter Cohen, who is the president of U.S. Education for McGraw-Hill, and has had a long and distinguished career at Pearson and a variety of other publishers. So you've seen just about everything. Let's start maybe with, it's an interesting time in the world. The ESSA has just been passed. We have a new administration. Let's start with K-12 for the moment. What's your view? And I'm going to throw a lot of things out there, but you can you've been through them all. We're hearing about Common Core. We're hearing about ESSA. What should we be expecting, and how does that transform or affect businesses like yours?
Well, at the federal level, I think nobody knows is the right answer, because you've got a brand new Secretary of Education, sounds like, with Betsy DeVos. And from what we understand, she's charter oriented, so we think there'll be more of the funding following the student, which means there's going to be more opportunities both in the charter school area, the private school area, the religious school area, if funding follows that. So on the positive side for education entrepreneurs, I think that'll be one outcome. There's a likelihood that more power will shift back to the states, because in theory we want less oversight in the administration coming up, which means that there'll be less federal rule and more opportunities to do something within a state that doesn't maybe work on a national basis, but will certainly work on a local basis. It's likely that there will be less intrusion from the Department of Ed, meaning less focus on high stakes testing, which again might mean that there's more flexibility for states to do what they want, to sort of alter their testing, to alter their curriculum more, which means there's probably more opportunity for variety than there have been in the past. So that's at the federal level, but as you already know, the federals only account for about 10% of school budgets. So the majority of what happens in education still happens at a state level. And consequently, I think the overall impact will be probably a little less regulation in the K-12 space, focus more on charter schools and private schools and funding following the student. The Common Core, which you well know has nothing to do with the federal government, is totally decided by each state, but probably will not be in any part of the legislation, so there won't be any carrots and sticks around doing something with the Common Core and therefore getting funding. So there'll potentially be more distribution of new standards. Right now I think there's 32 states left in a Common Core. That'll probably go down even more over time, but in general I don't think that states are going to jump to change their standards. They've got a cadence for that. 18 of the states have already created their own standards. They'll probably continue to go down that road, and you'll see a gradual shift to more states potentially using their own standards, which have turned out to be largely like the Common Core standards, because they're not bad standards in the first place.
And before we get into the business implications of this, is this a good thing or bad thing for our students?
Depends potentially on what kind of student you are. So if you are in the core, you're that 60% of students in the middle that education has done a reasonably good job of taking care of, there won't necessarily be that much change. If you're in the gifted and talented part of the student universe, there may be more flexibility and more funding potentially going to support those students. If you're in the disadvantaged set of students, then it's a question of what's really going to happen with Title I and IDEA funding, and that is a big unknown. So there's a pot of funding that probably totals in the neighborhood of $28 billion between those two, that could get shifted by a change in the approach in the Department of Ed.
Shifted away from low income or special ed?
It could. So there's this whole conversation around supplement, not supplant, in terms of how much funding the state has to provide, and whether that funding is on top of what the feds provide, or whether the funding they're giving you can take the place of what you would have spent before, depending upon the outcome of how that's interpreted under ESSA. It could mean that there's less money going to those schools where the students need it the most. So it's possible, but not necessarily true, that those students could not find as much funding. So I think that's one of the areas we have to watch as a society, and make sure that every student in America gets an opportunity to get a great education. Sure. And it's somewhat unknown as to whether that'll still be the case.
Sure. So as we shift to then your business hat, and I don't know what percent of the let's call it the curriculum market does McGraw-Hill have in K-12 in the U.S.?
Well, it depends on the year, but generally speaking, you can call it about a third.
Okay, so one of three, maybe the largest, or certainly in top three in every way you slice it. When you look at the landscape that you just went through, cross-reference adoptions, and for those who don't know, maybe you can describe the business model of adoptions versus non-adoptions. At the same time, we have this massive, or seemingly massive, transition to digital, though as massive as it often seems, it's perhaps much slower than it seems. How do you cross-reference that changing policy world, changing technology world, with your business strategy? And where I'm going to go afterwards is and then we'll jump from K-12 maybe to higher ed, but how that looks from your world, and where that also leaves opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation, and where you see there are opportunities.
All right, so quickly, the United States market is set into a group of states that are called open territory, meaning in those states there is no state mandate about buying curriculum in any certain year. Mostly the top part of the United States. The southern part of the United States is mostly what's called adoption territory, where the state determines when the entire state is going to adopt, for example, a new math curriculum. And they tend to adopt these curriculums for about a 7 to 10 year period. So each one becomes a big event, and you kind of win or lose, and you have this massive campaign against that state's adoption. For example, California had one that started last year around reading. So they did their entire K-8 curriculum for reading at one time, and they're spreading it over a 3-year period. But everybody who was interested in participating in the reading campaign would create a program specifically for this large called adoption. So the advantage from a business standpoint of an adoption state is you can sell the entire state at one time, which gives you great economy of scale. Otherwise, you may have Detroit buying reading, and you might have a part of New York City buying it, but you can't kind of figure out how big the total market is and when it's worth creating a new reading program, because only a district at a time might be adopting it. So from a business standpoint, the adoption cycle allows you to spend a lot of money and create a great curriculum. From a business standpoint, on the other side, once you've adopted, you're kind of stuck for 10 years or 7 years. And so somebody coming in 3 years in and saying, I'm going to create the best brand new social studies curriculum, it's like, well, no one's buying it. They're waiting 3 more years to buy it. So it kind of makes this very lumpy cycle about how the business itself actually operates. So that's kind of the difference between those two. The move towards digital is one of those things that's been talked about now since I've been in the industry, which is in 1996. We talked about the move towards digital and how it's going to change the world. And when I went to school, my kids went to school before that in the 80s, when Apple came up with their first computer, it was going to change the world. And it's going to change the world someday. We're just trying to figure out what day that is. But there's been a move towards, obviously, a shift to using technology in schools. Schools have always used technology. Now they're using more and more of it. Students that come to them today grew up with phones in their pockets. They grew up using an iPad. They learn to read on an iPad now. So the form factor for them is very engaging, very physical, very immediate, instant feedback. And so schools have to adjust to that. And students are requiring that adjustment more rapidly than teachers are. So if we say, why don't schools adopt technology more rapidly, we have to look at ourselves as an industry and say, well, let's think about why they don't. Schools don't have adequate broadband to give every student the ability to look at a video at the same time. There's not enough broadband available. By the same token, if they can do it in school, they can't do it in every household. So it's hard to say your curriculum is only going to be digital, but you can't study at home because you don't have access. So we've got an issue with broadband infrastructure. We have an issue with teachers and their ability to learn to use technology. When you think about a school that's adopted technology programs, they'll have a student information system, they'll have a learning management system, they'll have 35 apps, they'll have 3 sort of publisher type programs that each have their own requirements for how you put in the name, how you put in their passcode, how you manipulate where the buttons are, and they all have to learn that. And by the way, they get 3 days of training a year. So during this 3 days of training where they're trying to learn how to manage classrooms, how to learn about the new standards, what to do about fire and safety, what to do about social issues, and learn all this technology. So we've given them a task that's pretty impossible. So when our programs that serve schools get to be as easy to use as the app on your phone, which requires 0 instructions, then schools will adopt more rapidly. So that's one of the issues. When all of our technologies are seamlessly integratable, so that I can sign on once for the school and everything will flow through that sign-on, then it will be easier for schools to adopt. When the technology actually does what it's supposed to do, for example, does it add value? Technology for technology's sake isn't the be-all and end-all. Students are going to school, there's a scope and a sequence and a set of standards and curriculum that they are required to learn during this 180 days. And many of the technology things we have aren't well aligned to what it is schools expect students to do. So they come at it from various different places, and they sometimes solve a very small need out of that total universe. So now I, as a teacher, am trying to figure out how do I incorporate all these small needs into an overall day plan? And it's very complicated. So they're looking for simpler, curated solutions. So again, as an industry, as we think about it, how do we make it easy for them to buy? How do we make it easy for them to implement? How do we make it easy for them to manage in their day where they're responsible for making sure a student gets from here at the beginning of the year to there at the end of the year? And right now as an industry, we're very fragmented, so it's not that easy for them, which creates great opportunity.
So we'll jump back to opportunity in a second, but towards that picture you just painted, so what is working the best? And if you were Secretary of Education for the day, what policies would you enact to try to attack some of those challenges?
Well, when we say what is working the best, there are no silver bullets in education where we can say there is a single solution, system, strategy that works for all students. We talked about the needs for students who are gifted versus the needs for students who start behind. The need for students who have a social network that can support them versus those who don't have an adult at the same place at the same time. They may be living with relatives. So the needs for those people are very different. And all of our innate abilities are kind of different along a scale. So I don't think the idea that we should find a single solution is sort of going down the right track. I think you analyze the situation for an individual student in their situation, whether it's social, economic, geographic, et cetera, and say, what is the solution for that cohort of students that look like this type of student? And there are best practices in those areas. A few years ago, there was the What Works Clearinghouse that the Department of Ed tried to support, which was the idea of doing third-party research studies to demonstrate what actually was getting outsized gains versus the normal what happens during the 180-day school year. There are lots of flaws with the actual outcome of that, but the concept of saying let's measure output as opposed to inputs is actually, I think, a good approach. And then if you have a school that works like that school that used this solution, then you might find that to be a good place to start. I think at the end of the day that students still get engaged by teachers, and that trying to assume that technology can take the place of us having a live conversation is probably a mistaken strategy. Can we support this conversation with tools? It might be artificial intelligence, it might be augmented reality, it might be something that gets me more engaged, it might be something that adds to my level and depth of understanding, it might be something that assures that I've understood by demonstrating mastery over time. Those things are all part of education, but I think especially at the K-12 stage, the idea of engaging with another human being is probably what works best.
Sure.
And that we shouldn't try to get away from that. We should try to augment that and let people be able to move kind of at a pace that's right for them, which means personalizing education as much as possible. Still understanding that we have a social need in education for students to kind of move along and progress with people who are kind of at the same social age, if you will, the emotional age, as well as an intellectual age. And their intellectual age and their emotional age might be very different. And so trying to separate those two and allow them to go into those individual cohorts, I think makes a lot of sense.
So here, let's we keep our teachers at the center, or I guess our students at the center, but certainly the importance of teachers. But you mentioned personalization, so maybe we'll just jump there for a moment. And I know a few years ago, McGraw-Hill acquired a company called nGrade. And so two things maybe you could talk about is a little bit, what is the ultimate goal from I'm going to call them a publisher, but an education company like McGraw-Hill's in terms of personalization, and also just a little bit of acquisition. What is it that causes a McGraw-Hill to be interested in acquiring a company at what stage, and certainly for startups that are out there today, and we've worked together in a large organization where it's very clear it's very hard to do early stage innovation often. So A, maybe talk a little bit about personalization, and then B, just in terms of innovation and acquisition, how we should think about that.
So let me start with, you've got to figure out as a company, what your mission, vision, and strategies are, right? And so one of the things we identified is that as a company, we were focused on improving the lives of learners, making sure that every learner could learn at the right pace for that learner. To do so, you have to create programs that allow for this level of personalization so that every student can kind of stay in what they call their zone of proximal development, the area in which they're kind of comfortable answering a question, but still getting challenged. And so the basis for the way we now create programs is what we're thinking about as learning science basis. There's got to be a research theory or a demonstrative practice beneath it that says this is the right methodology for this student. So if you think that you are now in the learning science business as opposed to in the curriculum business, then you start to think about your acquisitions in a different way. So we've made 4 acquisitions in the time that I've been at McGraw-Hill, the last kind of 3.5 years. The first acquisition was a company called Area 9, which was an adaptive algorithm acquisition that provided the underpinning for personalized learning at scale. So with that acquisition, it allowed us to create a connection between content, probes, and standards, and each one being in a virtuous loop so that every student was learning exactly what they demonstrate was next in the line based on their mastery of the foundation piece just below that. That mastery learning approach allows students to progress more rapidly than kind of fumbling around trying to figure out what I'm ready to learn next and what I want to learn next. So that was the first company we bought.
And that underpins everything from
that
early
underpins all of our
to
higher ed programs and now all of our high school programs.
Okay.
So it's an algorithm that allows for adaptive learning at scale.
And you decided to buy as opposed to build that? How did those decisions happen?
So there was a company out there that had approached us a couple of years before, and it said, we'd done this for a medical category, and we were helping people pass essentially the equivalent to the MCAT in the United States with great success. And we looked at the technology and said, that has application in the courses that we deliver in higher ed. So we started partnering with them first. And in that partnership, we paid them essentially a royalty. And the more we got to know them, the more we liked it, the more it was like the Victor Kayam, I went on the razor company that none of these guys are old enough to remember, but it was the idea, this is good enough that we should own the company. Okay. So it was a buy before you, or try before you buy, essentially. Mm-hmm. So that's how we bought that one. Mm-hmm. The next one we bought was adaptive algorithms in the math area, a company called Alex, which had a great 12-year history of using this knowledge space theory to underpin how everybody can have their own essential pathway for math, because they'd spent 12 years figuring out every single way you could answer a question and mapped those pathways basically by hand, created the algorithms, and then created the pie for the entire math spectrum from 3rd grade up to calculus. That takes a heck of a lot of work. So they created this program. McGraw-Hill began representing them in the market in the higher ed space, and for 12 years was selling it as a product where we basically split the revenue. Same thing happens, like this is the best math program on the market, it's got great results, proven efficacy, 2 books have been written about it, numerous articles. We decided we should buy the company. Mm-hmm. So we ended up buying that company. The third company we bought was the one you mentioned called nGrade. And our concept behind that was, once you have all this data about how students learn, you need to provide the information back to its teachers and instructors so they can understand what a student needs to know next, whether they're ready for certain state assessments coming up, what we should be doing else to support them in their pathway. If you can't give them an easy way to aggregate that data from these various assessments they take from various places in school and put it into a dashboard that's easy for them to understand quickly, then you've got a bunch of data but no real value to it. So this company, Ngrade, had created a way to amass all that data, aggregate it, put it into a data dashboard and visualization for teachers that made it very easy to act upon. So I could see Jonathan hasn't met this standard in literacy, in vocabulary, and in compound words, and so he needs to work on that. And then you can connect that to content that would solve that problem for them. So we bought that company. We thought that would be its core use when we bought it. We liked the technology. It now underpins our next version of our entire open learning platform. So it kind of now has become the LMS through life. So we're using this now for corporations, where corporations now are using our adaptive algorithms. They're sitting on this Ngrade platform that doesn't have the Ngrade name anymore. And so we're also using it in K-12, and now it's in higher ed. We just released our first programs internationally. So we have 23 programs now in higher ed that sit on this Ngrade platform. So that was the third acquisition, and that one was a relatively small company. I'll say it was in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 million in revenue when we bought it. So it was a nice startup size. It demonstrated some scale, and it looked like us. For us, it fit well within our vision of what we were trying to accomplish. The fourth company we bought was just a couple of weeks ago, and it's called Redbird. And it's an adaptive math program and an adaptive reading program that was built by Stanford University. And it has a great background in gifted and talented. And they focus on the K-5 category. So Alex focuses basically on middle school through college. So now we have an adaptive math offering that goes from kindergarten all the way up through college. So it was a nice tuck-in into what we already had. That company was kind of in that same range of size when we bought it, and we hadn't had any experience with it beforehand. Did our due diligence on it, went and spoke with people at Stanford about the quality of the program, talked to customers, and negotiated a price, and it's our fourth tuck-in.
Nice.
And so when we think about build versus buy, we look at build, buy, and partner for everything we do. And sometimes building takes too long, and sometimes you have to build because when you think about the things that trip up large companies, it's multiple technology stacks. You can't manage and maintain multiple stacks that aren't connected. So if the company we're buying can't integrate into our technology stack or can't be refactored to integrate in quickly and cost effectively, it's just off the list. It's like the second screen we do right away.
I love that landscape, and we're going to jump to the studio audience in a moment. I want to go down the other way before, I know I said I was going to go to higher ed and corporate, especially now that you've got one platform. I'm fascinated to hear about that. But the statistics I've looked at show only about a third of Americans can read by third grade. And that's about the same amount that end up graduating high school, college, or career ready, or graduating from college. Are you looking down to the early stages at how we get more Americans able to read by the end of third grade? And I know you said there were no silver bullets, but is it possible that we can fix everything else if we can't have our population reading by early years?
Well, there's a great amount of research that says if you are off track reading by fourth grade, you're likely to be off track for life. So to your point, it's critical that we have students on grade level by fourth grade, or they're very unlikely to be successful. And if you look at the disaggregated population of who struggles with that most, it is those students who are either economically or socially underserved. And it's largely economically disadvantaged or African American males and Latino boys who are most underserved in that population. So we have to ask ourselves, why are they getting underserved in our schools today?
But again, when you limit it that way, at least from what I've seen, that doesn't account for 2/3 of the country.
On the reading category, it actually accounts for a lot of the country. Remember, we're 50% minority majority kind of at this point in school.
Okay.
So our schools are, lower income in general,
Yep.
and they are minority majority at this point in general. And so yes, it does account for a lot of the population. But I think to your point, the question is how do we get those students on grade level?
Yes.
And so, right now we actually have the best-selling reading program in California in this adoption that just came up. So I feel, and our company feels, a pretty significant personal responsibility for this next generation of readers to be successful. And I think there's kind of two things that have to happen. You've got to have a well-researched curriculum, and one that allows you to differentiate based upon where students are stepping in. So we've built in adaptive algorithms into our reading program called WonderWorks that allow students to be engaged at the level they're ready to learn at. So we have a very broad program. It's very flexible in terms of whether the school is a whole language orientation or a balanced literacy orientation or even a phonics orientation. The program allows for that kind of flexibility. It allows for complete technology delivery for those schools that want to learn and teach reading using technology completely. It also allows for complete print capability. So it's a very robust category of product. Part one is having the great content. Part two is great training in terms of teachers. And I think there we still suffer as a nation in how much training we allow in our schools. And this is something that gets negotiated between teachers unions and school districts, and it's a cost issue for the most part.
Right.
And then when a teacher's out of the classroom, somebody else has to be teaching in the classroom, so we tend to drive down how much training we're allowing to take place. So one category of opportunity in terms of entrepreneurialism is how do we do a more effective job of training teachers? The typical approach has been take all the teachers out of the class, sit them down in a group like this for a day, and they listen to someone speak about some subject area, and then they go back to their classroom and you don't know whether they've mastered it or not. So leveraging technology in the same way we are with students to demonstrate mastery as they're going through a course, not making them get together, go out of their classroom and do it, and chunking it into smaller parts so they can learn when they have time, is actually probably a more effective approach that would allow us to provide more training. As an example, my wife and I were just traveling to Cuba a couple of weeks ago, and she doesn't know Spanish, but she said, they speak Spanish there, I've got to learn Spanish. So she took one of these apps, this one happened to be Duolingo, and she started practicing with it. A free app on the web. She started practicing, my wife's a little unusual, 2 hours a day, which is probably not what most people do when they're using these apps, but she was doing it in 5-minute increments all day long. Every time she had a break for 5 minutes, she would do it. In 3 weeks down in Cuba, she was basically able to converse with people in Spanish. So the point is, she was able to learn a language, basically broken into small chunks of 5 minutes of training. So when we think about what we could do and what we could create, the idea that people, have 5-minute increments many parts of their day is a significant opportunity for us to create programs that allow teachers to get trained better. So I think there are plenty of tools out there to teach students to read. There are a number of programs that are adaptive. There are a number of companies out there that are creating content at various Lexile levels so every student can be engaged at the right Lexile level for them. We are spending a lot of time every day teaching literacy, and so it's really kind of holding people accountable for the quality of that teaching as opposed to the quantity of that teaching. And we're not there yet. I think we actually have to hold ourselves to a higher standard in grades K through 4 in literacy and demand more both of our students and our teachers. There's been a lot of research that says if you have high expectations for both, they'll both perform.
And if you take a look at the current state of learning science as well as the population and policies, if you were to make a prediction, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, are literacy rates going up? Are they going down? Are they staying the same at 4th grade?
So the literacy rates will go up. They won't go up as fast as we want them to. The technology allows for increasing amounts of personalization, and the technology is getting easier to use, and we can do it on mobile devices now, so there'll be more abundance of using it. So I feel confident that that will have an impact, but because it will be fragmented, and because there will be still a number of students who aren't advantaged and don't have the opportunity to use those programs, we'll still suffer. And because there's no kind of fell swoop where everybody takes on the best practice, because all schools are controlled by their school board, and across the United States there are 15,000 school boards, and each one gets to decide on what the best practices are for that school district, that we don't all adopt the things that work the best. We adopt the things that we like the best, as a school board, for example. And so best practices aren't always integrated into everybody's approaches. So I fear that it will be slower than it could be because of our kind of democratic approach to how we decide what gets taught in every school.
Well, let's hope we can do what we can to accelerate it. Let me turn to the audience, and since we haven't gotten to higher ed or corporate in particular, if there are any thoughts or questions and in those areas would be extra credit, but yes.
Yes, I'd like to ask
Maybe
you a question.
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Philippe de Estale, co-founder at Mission Table. I'd like to ask you a question about international students because it has a lot to do in terms of the U.S. economy. The change in administration, of course, has alerted parents, and they're asking questions. Students are wondering if USA continues to be a welcome destination. And the reason I ask that is because domestic numbers are going down for universities, they're increasingly looking towards international students as a source in terms of revenue. How does this impact universities and our position in the world as the leading destination, which has an impact on the economic side in terms of what it helps technology and all other work spaces?
If you were to look at the engineering graduates we have in the United States, and even look at the medical graduates we have in the United States, there's a disproportionate number who come from other countries. So if we were to shut off that supply of talent for the United States, it would have an impact. It would have an impact of shifting, I think, that knowledge back to other countries that then begin providing the resources that we need in America. And it would be good for other countries, frankly, because they would start to build their own economy, and I think it would hurt America. And I don't know, like anybody else, what will happen with an administration coming in that hasn't yet set a single policy into action yet. I suspect at the end of the day that the administration will also recognize the value of international students supporting American dreams and ideals. There may be a tougher vetting process about where those students come from and what hoops they have to jump through in order to learn in the United States, but I suspect that there are enough people who recognize the value that will continue to import talent. That's what I believe. I don't know. Does anybody have a different point of view or same point of view?
Or another question.
Anyone know? This will be topical for another month, and then you'll have the answer.
You have it.
Hi, my name's Andres, founder of the Talk List. So in higher ed, you see collaborative, community-based learning taking root. But I think the more conservative K through 12 is not as open to allowing other help to help a teacher to give more than just kind of one-to-many approach to learning. And with all this technology that's out there and more collaborative solutions, do you see that changing over time?
Well, it'll change more slowly, and it's for good reason. It's for the safety of students. So in higher ed, you're dealing with adults. Every adult can make their own decision about who they interact with on the web. When you're dealing with somebody who's under 18, it becomes the school's legal responsibility to make sure that student is well protected. The more social networks expand beyond a vetted group of people that I, the teacher, know, the more risk that the institution is taking on behalf of that student. And it just takes one incident to make people kind of draw back and say, we're not going to do that again. So I think that it purposely grows more slowly. As students outside of school and parents with their children outside of school get more and more comfortable with social networks on the web, I think you'll see those seep more into the school, and potentially over time, society will maybe not hold schools so accountable for what happens on those social networks. But if one school gets sued because something bad happens to a student through a social network that was sanctioned by the school, you're going to see the lawyers across the country say, we just can't have that happen. and we will continue to separate what happens in your private life and what happens in your school life. And so, and I don't think our laws are going to change to protect school districts from being sued. So I suspect they'll continue to be very conservative about that.
So we have a ton more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So maybe just close with one question.
Sure.
From where you sit, all the discussions we have, what right now has you the most excited and gives you the most hope?
You know, there's not sort of one thing that has me excited. I guess if I were to think of sort of one thing, it's around the concept that we are just at the early stages of leveraging technology to allow for a personalized approach to learning. And that, to the point that some of you are actually involved in here, the more that we can keep students engaged, because what we're allowing, the way we're allowing them to learn works best for them. It's a subject area they're engaged in, or it's an approach they're engaged in, whether it's visual, kinesthetic, auditory, etc., and a topic that can be related to something that they're engaged in. And because it is current as opposed to something that happened a long time ago. The more that we can allow education to be personalized in that fashion, I think the more we'll have students actually remaining engaged and learning, and they'll learn more because of that. Technology allows us to do that, and allows us to do that at scale. And we're just kind of at the early stages of leveraging what we know about how the brain works, and how people do learn, and how they remain engaged, and the ability to see when they're starting to drift off and do something to intervene in that. That, to me, is probably going to be the biggest impact on education overall. So it's great to see that kind of technology starting to take hold in schools, but we still know so little really in depth about how people learn that I think you're going to see us, you know, explode in that knowledge area over the next 10 to 20 years.
Great. Peter Cohen, President of McGraw-Hill US, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.